Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to next year's Development Discourse. Next year is a multi-competency firm focused on providing answers to complex development challenges. And Development Discourse is our public policy discussion platform. We're pleased to have Charlie Robertson with us today. Charlie is the global economist for Renaissance Capital, one of the leading frontier market-focused investment banks. Charlie's book, The Time Travelling Economist, Why Education, Electricity, and Fertility Are Key to Escaping Poverty, has received glowing reviews. Tyler Cohen of the podcast Conversations with Tyler, one of the most well-read economists, describes the book as one of the best popular economics books of the last decade and one of the best economics development books, period. Now, that's an endorsement. In the book, Charlie argues that to escape poverty, a country must focus on three things. The people must have about 70 to 80% literacy, cheap and affordable electricity for industrialization, and low fertility rates to ensure a higher savings rate, which translates to lower cost of borrowing. Let's start with education, Charlie. So when we think about education, is it mass or specialist education?
Yeah, look, there is an argument that the difficulty for a country in sub-Sahara or Asia, for that matter, 50, 100 years ago, as they became independent, was you need graduates to be teachers. You need graduates to be in government. You need graduates to be doctors. You need graduates to be engineers. You need higher education. You need good university education. But you also have to have the mass education numbers. And so what I did was I looked back at Korea. And Korea, when the Japanese kind of left it finally in the mid-1940s after World War II, they said that they had about 30% adult literacy. And they claim, there's a bit of a debate about the numbers, but they claim to have got to 90% by 1960. So in just 15 years, the government said, what we're going to do is make sure everybody can read and write. Mm-hmm. And that was what they prioritized first. Then they got into making sure everyone's staying at primary school until 11. And then they got into making sure everyone goes to secondary school. And then they focused on universities later. So they actually did it sequentially. Yes, they must have had a core group of graduates who could help run the country, but they focused on the mass education first.
Now, if we again look at what's happening with AI, for instance, and we find the kind of leaps and bounds in terms of how that technology is evolving and how it might be able to do some of the more mundane tasks, right? Have we missed the bus, being that we don't have that base of literate people who can do some of these little tasks that AI is beginning to do? Can we ever catch up, or is it, is it nighttime for us? Is it over?
There's a couple of, I can conclude in the book, talking about AI, that the book is premised on what we've done over the last 300 years. Mm-hmm. And this is how countries have developed over 300 years. Is it possible that the technology advances we're seeing today will change the equation in some ways? I focus in the book on if we now have the internet and you can do a service job for an American while sitting in Lagos and earn a similar salary, then perhaps you don't need to build an expensive factory and expensive roads and expensive ports to ship manufacturing goods. You can just jump straight to selling services, your smart brain, mm-hmm. to the Americans. Yes, I hope so. We haven't got any data to show countries have done that yet, but it would be great if that means the cost of jumping from poverty to relative wealth is going to come down because you don't have to invest so much in infrastructure. More broadly, and stepping back to your question better, I think we've always seen technology lead people to fear that jobs were going to be lost, that you're going to create mass unemployment, that some countries would never, catch the rising tide of development. But so far, anyway, it keeps on being this cascading of kind of textile factories that's all we used to do in Britain. And then the Americans started to do it, then the Japanese, then the Chinese, then the Vietnamese, now it's the Bangladeshis. And each decade, we see those textile factories basically moving around the world. And I think they will end up in Egypt in the next 5 or 10 years. I think Kenya, possibly in 5 to 10 as well. So I still think those jobs are going to come. And that clever AI thing I can tap into the computer isn't going to make me the T-shirt that I need to wear, or at least not cheaply. So I don't think Nigeria's missed the boat. It's just not quite ready to catch this rising tide at a national level. At a local level, literacy rates in Lagos are 80% or more. So Lagos, with all of its 10 to 20 million people, could easily be part of this boom story.
In fact, I'm going to come back to the Egypt you mentioned and how Egypt's economy is growing and could overtake Nigeria, and look for the link to education. Or maybe you want to speak to that now before I go to this other question on Lagos.
No, I'm very happy to, because what was interesting about Egypt is, it's got this fantastic geographical location between Asia, Africa, Europe, on the Suez Canal. This should be a country that is thriving, but they only got their adult literacy rate up to about 70–75% in 2010. And so just when they got there, finally, after 5,000 years, they finally get to 70% adult literacy. We then have the Arab Spring in 2011. And 2 years later, we get a coup. And then for 3 years, we get FX restrictions. Then the currency devalues in 2017. It's chaotic. 2018-19, we start to get a bit of stability. Then COVID comes. It's just been one blow after another. They've had a bit of bad luck. But they have only just been, 10 years ago, got to the point where they could take off. And they've got power. They've got enough power to drive it, because their fertility rate came down about 20 years ago. So people have been saving into the banks. So they have power. They have sufficient amount of money to provide some investment. They've got the human capital. They just need 2–3 years of macro stability, and I think the factories will start to arrive. Now, Nigeria's not there yet. The fertility rate's much higher. Savings are much lower in Nigeria. The literacy rate's still not at 70–75%. It's around 62, I think, at the end of the last decade. So we're getting there. Compare that to 20% in 1960. We're now at 62%. That's been huge improvement, but not quite there yet.
So you mentioned in the book, and I think some people might see this as a bit controversial, that in trying to expand electricity, right, you shouldn't be looking to provide everyone electricity at the same time. That you may want to focus on the electricity that leads to industrialization, and then later you go to the rural electrification, etc. So basically, the approach Nigeria has taken on trying to drive rural electrification or just universal access may not be the right strategy. Can you help us unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, this is really controversial stuff. Controversial, it just makes me, it's very easy to paint this guy sitting in an office with electricity and it all works almost all the time, and say, easy for him to say everyone can't be given electricity yet. But it's not about not thinking it's the right thing. Of course it's the right thing that everyone should have electricity. It's just, can you afford it? And countries with low savings can't afford it. So you've got a finite amount of cash, and it's not much, to build some electricity. And if you go down the path of saying we're going to give it to everybody, then everybody gets a little bit of electricity, but not enough to help power the whole economy. It's loss making, because a lot of people can't pay for the electricity, so the government then has to subsidize the electricity price. So what happens in the West is households subsidize business. So business gets cheaper electricity so they can make goods in the West, and households pay somewhat higher bills because they're not the big users. And that works. And that's still true in a country like Germany today. They pay like 30 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity versus 10 for industry. So the German households are still paying so much more, but that's the opposite's happening in, say, Kenya, where households have been given subsidies to use electricity. Now, what do you use
Nigeria
electricity
as
on?
well.
Sorry.
Nigeria as well.
Yeah, well, and the difficulty is you've got electricity, what are you going to do? You're going to plug in your mobile phone. Where's the mobile phone coming from? Korea, China. So you're importing this mobile phone. That's causing a drain on your foreign exchange reserves. You're subsidizing the electricity consumption, which is causing a drain on the government finances. The government then hasn't got money to build a better road or a better port to help Nigeria export stuff. So you end up in a situation of bankruptcy, and that's what we're seeing in Ghana today, unfortunately, and it is a problem for some of the electricity companies across the continent that they don't make money. And if they're not making, they should be supporting the growth story. They should be making manufacturing competitive by selling electricity to the people who will pay them, and pay them a price that you can be profitable at. Because then you invest more in electricity. If you're making a loss on electricity, why invest more in it? You're not going to. So you get this shortage then. So you go back to America or France or any of the countries back in the early 20th century or the 19th, industry was focused on first. Households came later. And Korea, actually, in the 1970s, it was all about industry first. And it was only in the 1970s that the government said, okay, now the villagers can have electricity, but they have to pay for it themselves. We'll lend them the money as a loan, but they have to pay for it. And that model worked beautifully for Korea.
And I agree with the argument, although I know it's going to be a hard sell for some of my new socialist friends, who want to see equality, without kind of measuring the cost of it. But another question I have, because I understand the trajectory of the discussion, fixed education, fixed electricity, and then we get to fertility in a minute. But before we go to fertility, I wonder if there were other variables, other factors you considered as you were looking at this model that did not make it into the final model. So for instance, should a country be also looking at roads, because it kind of opens up access from that industry to trade, right? Or did it not make the model? And if it didn't, why didn't it?
That's an interesting subject. And I think it's actually very related to why China and how China has been lending $1 trillion nearly on this Belt and Road initiative to low-income countries. Because but we step back a bit and say, how did China make money in the first place? China built its factories right on the coast, so they didn't have to build roads, they didn't have to build railways. They prioritized making sure there was energy and a port, so you could supply textiles and get it out of a port and sell it to a richer country. And that worked for Japan just as it had worked for Korea, and before that, Japan. And in fact, you go back far enough, the UK, made a lot of its money by exporting its textiles around the world. Correct. And it was a very island-based story. Now, Africa's quite lucky in that actually the very high proportion of the population is on the coast of the continent. So it makes most sense, say, in Kenya or the Mombasa should be part of that first bit of the growth story, or in Nigeria, it should be Lagos.
Port Harcourt, yeah.
Exactly, because you've got that easy, cheap, it's all about cheap access to the rest of the world. What the Chinese then did 20 years later was, so after they did their takeoff of the coastal areas, Shanghai and Canton near Hong Kong, they then said, okay, now we've made money. Now we've got even more cash in our economy. Now we can afford to roll out roads, trains, high-speed trains inland, and that will then help bring those inland areas up as well. It's very much, the wealth in China is very much along the coast. I don't know which way you'd see this, but anyway, it's along the coast. And now they're rolling it into the rest of the country, paid for by their own huge savings from 20 years of very successful export growth. And that, I think, has to be the way it goes. This is bad news for Congo. It's tough times for Central African Republic, Burkina Faso, Niger. There's a whole load of places that it's a real struggle now to escape from the poverty they're in. And then that Bolivia in Latin America has the same problem. So, but that's just, yeah, that's geographic bad luck for you.
Sure. And so there's another data point you put in the book where, and you were looking at data coming out of Ibadan in 1970, where the study found that about 95% of the educated people in the rural communities left the rural communities, right, and moved to the cities. And as I read that part, I said, and again, being that this is the Time Travelling Economist book, I said, okay, if we traveled into the future, right, are we seeing what we saw in the past with a lot of Nigerians of means, of ability, leaving Nigeria for the West, right? Is it the same thing we're seeing? And what could that potentially play out in terms of development for the country, right? And then the flip argument I had was, what kind of happened in India, where the folks that left into the diaspora, the non-resident Indians, sent back remittances, and when India was ready to open up, they came back with their connections to the world and then built out India to what it is today. So I was torn between the migration or immigration we're seeing today being a totally bad thing to maybe could be a good thing. And I wonder where, if you consider this in the book, and where your arguments lie.
I get to that in chapter, I think it's chapter 5 of the book. It's near the end, and I talk about this because it's going to be huge. We think immigration is a big story out of Nigeria now. It's going to get so much bigger in terms of numbers. And it really struck me when I was in Uganda a few months ago talking about the book. And I was being told there that so many Ugandans are also getting on the plane. They're going to the Gulf, they're going to Egypt, and they're getting jobs. And what it is when you've got an educated population, but you haven't got much in the way of savings because you're still a high fertility country, what you've got is not enough capital to create jobs, but you've got lots of people seeking jobs who are literate, educated enough to be able to do value-added work. So what do? Some of them leave. And this we saw in the 19th century out of Europe. Who filled America up? Who filled up Argentina? Who filled up Australia? Where did the whites in South Africa come from? They came from Europe saying there's not enough jobs here because we're quite a high fertility continent at the time. You go back to my great-grandparents, and they were all like having 7 kids. You know, that was, so what do? Well, one of them went to Venezuela, another one went to South Africa, another one went to America. And that flood of people we saw, and we saw it out of Ireland 60, 70 years ago, Catholic Ireland, lots of kids were quite well educated, so they left. And we see it in the Philippines 30 years ago, well educated, but happens to be Catholic as well. So a lot of them went to Dubai. Well, actually, then it was Hong Kong and Singapore to do jobs. So it's just a normal part of the story. The problem is you're educating these bright, energetic, motivated people, and then they're leaving. And yeah, some tens of billions of dollars of remittances can come back to Nigeria, but you know that a lot of the gain is being given to another country. That, unfortunately, I don't see a very easy way out of that. And some very good work done by the Center for Global Development, a guy called Michael Clemens. He says that actually the propensity to leave, to migrate, has grown over the last 50 years. So if you go back 50, 60 years, people start to leave as the country gets richer because they're better educated. And there's even more people leaving nowadays for richer countries than there used to be. I don't know what can be done about it. It's not all bad because the remittances do come back and the skill set does come back as well
And the
sometimes.
global network, yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the knowledge base then about Nigeria that's going to come, Canadians are going to be so much better aware of what Nigeria is about as a country because of the Nigerians they'll be working with in Toronto and Montreal and stuff.
So the third leg of the tripod, or the model that you've put together, is fertility, right? And I was wondering if you could trace for us the link between family size and savings rates and interest rates and just national credit rating and our ability to fund investments in the country. Yeah,
well, to me, this is actually the most important part of the book because it took me so long to realize its importance. You sit there as an economist working at banks, which is what I've done for 25 years, and all you're looking at is the next month's inflation rate, the next month's trade data, this quarter's GDP figures. And the idea that demographics matters is ridiculous. It's like, oh, come on, population change is a 10-year, 20-year story. What possible difference does it make?
Yeah.
But when I was trying to find out how come China had savings that meant its interest rates were 2%, while Kenya didn't have savings and its interest rates were double-digit, like Nigeria's is today. And I found this IMF paper that said half of the rise in household deposits in China could be directly attributed to the one-child policy. I thought that's weird. That surely wouldn't work anywhere else because no one else did a one-child policy, right? Nothing like on the same scale. But actually, when I then looked at the fertility rate, how many kids the average woman has, and I compared it to bank deposit data, it's a really, really strong correlation. If you've got 5.5 kids per woman on average, which Nigeria does, about 5.3, you have bank deposits, the amount of money that a family can save and put into the bank on a Friday night, 20% of GDP. You go to Mauritius, which got its fertility rate down in the 1980s, finally, below 3. It's now 100%. So Mauritius has got great airports, great roads, plenty of power. It's done textiles. In fact, it's given up on textiles. It's moved now into high value-added financial services. It's that well off in the space of 40 years. You go to Morocco, fertility rate below 3, bank deposits, 100% of GDP. How much does it cost you to borrow money in Morocco? Well, until a year ago, this last year's been a bit messy, but until a year ago, for all of the last decade, about 2 to 3%.
Yeah. Same
as China. So get your family size down. And when you have 2 or 3 kids, what do? It's all about investing for those kids. You want them to get a good education. You want to save for them to help make sure that they've got that. And you can afford to save because you're not spending every penny you've got trying to feed or clothe or school 5 or 6 kids on average. I mean, obviously, we all know rich people who've got loads of kids and can afford to manage everything reasonably well. But on average, at a country level, that's not how it works. So interest rates end up going lower and lower and lower the smaller the family size gets in a country. And that's why Western interest rates are low, Chinese rates are low. All of Asia, actually, apart from Pakistan and Afghanistan, pretty low.
Okay, and just to say to the participants, you can type in your questions and we'll take them in a few minutes. But Charlie, so I think the magic number, and you were very clear on this in the book, that we shouldn't be looking to go the one-child policy of China, right? The magic number could be somewhere between 2 to 3 children. But you see, total fertility rate is influenced by certain interrelated factors, right? Like childbearing age, lifetime fertility, duration between births, and etc. Adolescent first birth is a big issue in Nigeria. Some of the data shows it's somewhere between 18 and 21%. The mean age of sexual intercourse is about 17 years as well. The low use of contraceptives, right, is very low, despite the many years of campaigns in some parts of the country for contraceptive use. So how best can Nigeria delay the start of childbearing age, right? If you travel back in time as a time traveling economist to Europe or Asia, what were some of the programs that these governments implemented to delay the start of childbearing age?
Yeah, that Europe didn't. And
Okay.
it took a really, really long time for the fertility rate to come down. If the continent, the area that looks most like Europe in the 19th century is Latin America.
Okay.
Also taken a very long time to get the fertility rate down. And the consequence of that is that industrialization took a really long time to happen. It took like 100, 150 years to happen. China's done it in 25. Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, all did this very quick reduction in fertility rates, and they all boomed quicker than we've ever seen economies boom in the 20th century. Interestingly now, those four, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Korea, Singapore, have four of the lowest fertility rates in the world, at about 1 kid on average or less per woman. And that is a problem. That's a problem.
Yeah.
They're aging fast, and Korea is going to be the oldest country in the world by 2030. So you not do that, well, I think we could and should encourage smaller family sizes to that 2 to 3 level, but make sure you don't go overboard, which is what East Asia's done. So how do you do it? First, you educate girls. So if they're in school until 18, firstly, you're getting that high adult literacy you need to take off. And secondly, you're not leaving school at 14 as they do in Niger, just not the state, just the country to the north. And then having the first kid at 14, 15, second kid at 17, third kid at 19, 20. So the contrast, if you keep girls at school until they're 18, the first kids at 19, 20, you've already reduced the fertility rate by 2. So educate women, and it gives them the choice then to consider careers and so on. Secondly, you're absolutely right, that contraception use, encourage, just making it acceptable, making it available helps. But the thing which really struck me when I looked at the data was, and this is, I found it quite heartbreaking really, was how correlated the number of kids you have is with child mortality rates. When 10% chance of a kid under the age of 5 dying in Nigeria, 10% chance, that's very strongly correlated with having about 5 to 6 kids on average. So when you have the chance of losing a kid, and you'll know people who have, if you live in the poor areas with these higher mortality rates, then you have extra kids. And that doesn't actually make you better off financially. It's not a financial call. It's just one of those things. So if you could possibly reduce that mortality rate down to, say, 2 or 3%, that's consistent with people having 2 to 3 kids instead of 5 or 6. And it's not that expensive. So I was comparing countries like Rwanda, which does have about 3 or 4% mortality rate, and is poorer than Nigeria on average, and yet less than half as much chance of a child dying under the age of 5 in Rwanda. So Rwanda's going to have the demographic dividend quicker, because their fertility rate will come down below 3 by, well, sometime in the 2030s. Then they'll have the savings to take off. So educate girls, contraceptive use, government campaigns, just telling people you'll be better off. In the long run, you will be better off by having 2 or 3 kids. That's helps. And the child mortality thing. It's so it's multi-pronged kind of.
I know, and we've seen the data shows that there's been a bit of a decline in total fertility rates in Africa.
Yeah.
Even in Nigeria, it's dropped from 7 to about 5.3. Yeah. But that drop or the decline has been much slower in Africa than in other parts, and especially if you compare where we are today versus, again, if you're looking back in time. What's causing this slower pace, and are there lessons, are there things we can learn from other parts of the world? So for instance, religion could be a factor for us, right? But we know that Latin America, also Catholics mostly, Ireland, so are there lessons on how they were able to do it in these religious conservative societies that we can learn from?
Yeah, I have to say, I've got a colleague of the head of our office in Kenya is Catholic, and he just thinks I've got a personal vendetta against him on this issue. I'm saying, I genuinely, suddenly, I really don't. I really don't. Well, it's the data. I did read into a lot of the research on this stuff, and it's conflicting. Some research says education, religion is not the issue. Some says you can see that it is an issue. We know that if you go to Bangladesh, they're having less than 2 kids per woman. Bangladesh had a population bigger than Nigeria if you go back 30, 40 years. Now Nigeria is tens of millions larger than Bangladesh. And Bangladesh has got the savings and is industrializing, and is, all our Adidas shoes and Nike shoes are all made in Bangladesh now. It's part of that big success story. So religion doesn't stop. It isn't sufficient to stop it. Italy's got one of the lowest birth rates. It's a Catholic country. So it may be a factor. There's an argument that there's a preference for larger families, but in Africa than other countries. But I know there was a preference in the UK for 6, 7 kids, because that's what my great-great-grandparents were doing in the 1890s. So that can change, and I think it changes with broader education. So there's a lot of uncertainty about it, and on some of the data, it suggests there's no difference between Africa and anywhere else. It's just simply that child mortality story. Perhaps there's not been quite enough investment in maternal healthcare. There's loads of other researchers who can get into all that stuff. All I know is this is where countries need to be if they want to be free of the IMF, if they want to be free of a dependence on foreign capital, if they want to have their own savings to grow. Smaller family sizes of 2 to 3 kids on average is how it's done.
Okay, so we've got a new government that will be coming into power later next month. So they read your book, they understand we need to focus on education, we need to focus on electricity, fertility rates, but they're wondering, what's the lag time? How long, if we really start investing in these things, when are we going to start seeing results, right? Especially for a politics that has a much shorter time frame than the time frame in your book.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of the problem. I come into government now, Nigeria. I've got an overvalued exchange rate. I've got an unaffordable fuel subsidy. Am I going to spend my time and focus trying to improve demographic trends that'll make a difference in 10 or 20 years' time? Or am I going to try and concentrate on the urgent issues right now? And inevitably, I think governments tend to focus on the right now. I think the challenges are so multivariate when the IMF's talking right now about the global economy facing the polycrises of inflation and all the other recession issues, and it's like governments like the government coming into Nigeria, they're facing polycrisis every day. This is what it is to run a country, a low-income country. It's really hard. So, and sadly, the payoff is not this electoral term or even the next one. It's if you get demographics right, you can get your fertility rate down by about 2 in a decade. That's about the fastest it's ever been done. So if we're at 5.3 in Nigeria, in a decade, if the government made it as 100% priority, we could get to 3.3 kids by 2033. Okay, so let's say 2035, we're finally at 3 kids. So in 12 years' time, bank deposits are starting to pick up. Interest rates are starting to come down. The boom is possible then, at late 2030s. Into the 2040s will be really great. But that's still 15 years away, really, from now. And that's if you make it what are your top priorities? And at the same time, you've got to be making sure these girls are all getting educated in every state and coming out literate. And that payoff is partly for them and partly for their kids who will be educated as a result as well, when they then have them. So again, that's a 10, 15-year payoff. No president who's in there for 1 or maybe 2 terms is going to be saying this is going to, and people won't then give Tinubu the credit. Let's say he did it.
Yeah.
But he's not going to get the credit in 10, 20 years' time. 20 years' time, people will say, whoever the president is in 2040, he's the man or woman who's created this high growth story. He'll get the credit, not Tinubu for what he got right in the 2020s.
Yeah. And that's the problem with, you know, the difference in timelines and what we need to do and when the payout does happen. But again, switching our hats to what can we do to escape this poverty trap, right? I've got a question from a Chris Ogunkoya, and his question is, in all the things you've looked at, how about government financial incentives to encourage smaller families? Has that worked? Do we have any data on where the government kind of incentivized smaller family size without trying to be draconian in saying this is how you do it? Has that worked? Do we have any data to back that kind of thing up? If not, what worked? I've
not heard of that. All I can say is that those old countries in the Northern Hemisphere that are already wealthy, that are trying to get people to have more kids through incentivizing them with cash, it's not having much effect. They're trying it in Hungary, in Russia, Poland, Iran. I mean, it's having some effect, but it's not having as much effect as they wanted. So I'm not sure, but I don't know on the other way. I don't think I can't think of a government that's done it in terms of trying to shrink the population size. I think when governments decide this is something that needs to happen, it can happen fast. It happened fast in Iran in the 1980s. The government said, whoa, population explosion, this is a problem. They went too far, by the way. Iran's now one of those countries with too few kids, but I think it's just making it a central core message is already a start. But no, it's a good question. I haven't seen the data on it.
Yeah, and you know, there are a few other questions here. One on corruption. You know, it's one of these topics that always comes up when we discuss Nigeria. And I'd like to get your take on the interplay between corruption and poverty and how to escape poverty. There's a great book I read a few months ago by Yuan Eng on the Gilded Age, China and corruption, and where her argument is there are different forms of corruption, and there are one form of corruption that actually could lead to economic growth. The other ones, you know, lead to underdevelopment. Unfortunately, she uses Nigeria again as a classic example of grand theft, which is a form of corruption that pulls us down. But in your research, you know, how does corruption play on poverty, and what are ways that we can get out of it?
Yeah, I'm unconvinced by that argument in the Gilded Age. I think what people are doing is they don't like corruption and they don't understand why countries take off. And so when they see corruption and countries taking off and doing brilliantly well, like Korea or China or Vietnam, they then have to try and explain that by coming up with a slightly complicated argument about how some corruption is good and some corruption is bad. What I'm saying is all countries take off when you have literacy and small family sizes, because there's so much money in the economy because of household savings. Interest rates are so low that even if the government is corrupt, you can still go out and borrow cash from the bank and build a business. But when you're in Nigeria and borrowing from a bank is costing you 10 or 20% a year, I mean, you have to be absolutely rock solid sure that your business is going to take off if you're borrowing at that sort of rate. In fact, you can't do it. You can't really afford to take that sort of, so you can't grow a business. You can't invest. You leave the country if you're that motivated, perhaps to go to Canada to get a job instead. So what I can see in the data is there's a strong correlation between corruption scores, where 100 is good, you don't have too much corruption, and 0 is awful. and per capita GDP. And nearly all low-income countries score badly on the corruption scores, and nearly all high-income countries don't. And the relationship, I think, is to do with tax. So if you are in Nigeria and there's a few million taxpayers, maybe 10 million, maybe 20. I mean, I've seen some big numbers, but you've got 200 million people, but only 220, and only 10 million are paying tax. There's a lot of people who aren't paying tax. So if the government's stealing money, are they stealing your money? Well, sort of, but it's not really yours. They're not actually taking it out of your pocket and then stealing it. So I think people they haven't got time or effort to care. They're trying to get food on the table. Whether 5% is getting stolen by the government's less of an issue. But when the middle class gets big, like Korea in the last 10, 20 years, and the president's stealing money, and it's your money now, it's your taxes, then you get pissed off. And right now, Korea's got 4 presidents in jail. This is the most successful development story until China came along, the most successful development story on the planet ever. 4 presidents in jail now. They didn't arrest them back in the 1990s when they were just booming. They're arresting them now when the middle class is big enough to say, you know what, this is not acceptable anymore. So I think that the corruption issue is a constant problem. Yes, it hurts development. Now, if the government's stealing money and it's not going into electricity generation, it's not going into roads, it's not going to schools, of course, this is not helpful, but it's also really normal. Everybody's gone through it. And so my argument is that we will see that big progress against corruption in decades to come in their low-income countries. And right now, in the countries that have now got to $25,000, $30,000 per capita GDP. When you get to $20,000, $30,000 per person, that's when the corruption really falls.
Sure. And I appreciate you're an economist and not a political scientist, but I have this political science question for you. So lots of scholars have talked about democracy as almost like a prerequisite, for development to happen, right? We've seen China and all of that. We put that in a bucket. But if we continue the way we are in Nigeria, low literacy, high fertility rates, low savings, the economy is not growing, don't we run a risk that there could be a switch where people begin to ask for like a more communist, socialist type of political arrangement or a less liberal form of government, and that puts democracy at risk? What's your view on this, and how do we prevent this from happening?
You're right to raise the question. And one of the ways we've tried to look at that is by quantifying all the times that any country has lost democracy since 1960. And what I do is I look at per capita GDP, because rich countries don't lose democracy, properly rich countries. They never lose it. Oil countries, oil exporters like the Gulf, who are exporting 500 barrels a day, they never lose their stable regimes either. So wealthy countries tend to be pretty stable. The chance of Nigeria losing democracy in any normal year is actually only a few percent. If we look at the hundreds of cases of countries with Nigeria's wealth level, even if I include things like an inflation shock or falling incomes, 95% chance that every year democracy is maintained. But
Charlie, if you look back to Europe, right? If you look, again, time traveling, if you look at where we are now and you look at when Europe was where we are now, and it's the same conditions that pushed Europe to embrace more of the less liberal form. So I'm thinking here Germany, I'm thinking Russia, I'm thinking Italy.
Yeah. Yes.
And what says that we might not travel that path?
Russia, I mean, I looked into that issue because Russia, China, you had this issue of not yet literate enough to do full-on industrialization. Very rapid population growth, not enough jobs, and that did contribute to both those countries going communist, and Vietnam, probably, Korea, North Korea. I mean, there was a whole host of countries that did this. And interestingly, that communist model actually helped. Because what the communists do then is say, right, enough of this choice stuff. Everyone's going to school. There is no, everyone has to read our communist propaganda. So everyone's going to go to school. Everyone's going to learn to read and write. Now, the consequence of everyone learning to read and write is that fertility rates start to fall. So savings start to grow. So that then helps provide the cash to do the investment. So that communist model, and the Ethiopians are trying to do it. To some extent, the Ethiopians have been doing this for about 20 years. They started from such a low base. I mean, a really low base, but they've had very strong growth on that model. Eventually, it goes wrong, but it can help for that. It can help kickstart that first 20 years. And also, they steal your savings. So the communist government comes in and says, no, you're not allowed, Patrick, you're not allowed your own bank account with your own kid. We're going to take that bank account and we're going to use that money to build a power station. And you're saying, I'm not sure I really want that. They're saying, this is for the good of the country, Patrick. That works. That does work. And I do wonder whether we're going to see that sort of challenge, actually. I don't know. I then get told by all the entrepreneurial Nigerians I know, no, we're too into our freedom. We're too into here,
We hope. But I've got another question from Ike Okonkwo, and it's more of a climate question here. Desertification and other environmental challenges facing Nigeria. How does this affect the sequencing on how we address poverty? Do we still go for education, then electricity and fertility rates, or do we focus on addressing this more existential issue? I guess you can add other existential issues to that as well.
He's raising that exact point that there's so many challenges coming at a government. I'm a little bit torn, but not too torn, because if you're sitting in a wealthy country that's consuming so much energy, I think the carbon emissions for the average Brit is about 4 tons per person. For the average American, it's about 16, 17 tons per person. The average Nigerian, it's about 0.1, 0.2. I mean, it really is. You guys are like the saints, the angels of the planet right now, and you're doing so little to worsen the environment and to do damage in terms of that actually I think the focus should be making sure that there are jobs for people. People could start to save money. That's what's the priority for the government, in my view. The desertification issue, though, does feed into part of what the problem is, comes from population change. So if you keep on having 6 kids and your 6 kids have another 6 kids, that little plot of land you've been relying on to feed your cows, it doesn't sustain the cows for 1 person anymore. It's now sustaining the cows for 36 people. And what happens is the Fulani herdsmen have to move around a lot. They have to move to areas they've never moved to before, causing or contributing to social conflict. So actually the climate change issue plus the population rise are combining in a negative way to I would argue, contribute to instability in the north. So actually, I'd still come back to smaller family size slows that negative process.
And I mean, I think I read, maybe I read or I watched it in one of your interviews where you said you looked at the SDGs and, there are so many of them, and you've kind of, built this model where we can focus on these 3 fundamental ones. And when we get them right, we can begin to solve the other ones. And I thought that resonated with me. But I have a question here from Yemisi Ransom Kuti. And her question is, what impact would decentralization or restructuring of the Nigerian economy have on the poverty question? And as anyone who's followed Nigeria, we always come back to this restructuring question. It's interesting that the government coming into power in May is also focused on restructuring. what could that do for the economy? Just to tag onto the back of that we've actually started doing something. This, one of the things you must give the Buhari administration is that it just recently signed into law an amendment of the Constitution that empowers the states to generate, transmit, and distribute electricity. So now we're not stuck to one national grid. The states, it's now decentralized, where the states can take care of their problems. So I guess our question is, how much more can a move towards this type of decentralization be a route out of Nigeria's poverty?
I think it could be very helpful, because the country at a national level has got a real challenge right now, that much of the wealth, much of the taxes is being made in the South. Mm-hmm. And do you, as the government, say, okay, the South is relatively well off, we're going to take the profits of their success and help support the people in other parts of the country who don't have that wealth? Or do you say, my goodness, this is the one bit of the economy doing well, let's channel all of those resources back into the bit that's doing well? Because if Lagos, for example, could double its economy in the next 7-10 years and double it again in the next 20, it'll provide so many more taxes to do so much more with, to support the whole economy, the whole country. Surely we should let Lagos keep the money it's making so it can invest and become even more profitable. So it's that, do you take the profits now, but then reduce the amount of profits in the future? Or do you reinvest the profits and try and build an even bigger and more successful story? That's a horrible political choice to make. If you come from the North, you're probably going to say, give us the money now. And if you come from the South, you'll probably say, no, let us keep the money now. So this decentralization gets past that issue. If it's enabling states to do more, to take advantage of smaller family size, probably more savings. I would guess there's more bank savings in Lagos than elsewhere in the country. So you've probably got more cash available for local businesses there. You've got the more literate population. If you can sort out the electricity and you've already got the access to the port, Lagos then could be this powerhouse within the economy. Not just Lagos, some of the surrounding states as well, and potentially Port Harcourt and around there too. You could get these really successful parts of the economy. And to be fair, that was the UK. But for us, it was the North that was successful at first, Manchester and all the industrial zone, and the South or the East was a bit lagging. In Italy, it was the North that was successful, and not the South. And in China, for a long time, it was the coastal region before it became the inland region. So, and there they were given a lot of flexibility. In China, the local provinces were allowed to try out different methods to see what was it that was going to work. And when one province kind of hit on the magic solution near Hong Kong, it's like, okay, we'll start copying that. So there is a challenge of a shortage of savings that is a nationwide problem and will continue to be a difficulty. But at least the education and maybe some local energy, electricity success stories can start to prove what Nigeria could be, and it all comes good.
So I have a question here from Trevor Ward. He's one of the leading consultants in the hospitality space. And his question is, you make a lot of reference to GDP quite a lot, but how reliable are the data on GDP? And surely the Nigerian GDP figure is, of course, an average of northern Nigeria and Lagos. Is there a better measure that we should use in looking at these issues?
Trevor's asking a tough question.
Yeah.
I had one of my little light bulb moments in Lagos in December when I was presenting, and I suddenly thought about that child mortality rate, the odds of dying under the age of 5. And I said, it's a very high rate for a country with Nigeria's average per capita GDP. But what if most of Nigeria isn't at the average? And we know it's not. What about if Lagos is up there at $5,000 to $10,000, and a lot of the rest of the country say at $1,000? Then actually that child mortality rate isn't that different in Nigeria than some of these other countries. And what it's telling you is that the inequality is distorting some of those national average numbers. Is there a better way of trying to? No, I don't.
The question for me is not even the GDP question, because I mean, there's been a lot of argument around GDP. Is it the best measure or not? But for a government that's looking to drive development, right, be it at the federal or the state level, I keep thinking, what's that figure that can channel everybody's minds? And if we're able to meet those numbers, then it creates some kind of a ripple to other economic sectors, right? But it also helps to get the people to know what the government is focused on. So as I read the book, I said to myself, okay, what if Nigeria set a target for itself, 100% literacy, right? And we know that we're chasing 100% literacy. Is there a good causal link between 100% literacy and a route out of poverty, right? And you make a lot of these arguments in your book, but if we focused on that number, will 10 years from now, will we see that we've exited poverty, or are there other numbers we need to look at? So maybe 100% literacy, X percent kilowatts per capita, and 2.5 fertility rate. What are those numbers that every state and federal Nigeria can start chasing?
Yeah, it was 70 to 80% adult literacy is enough.
Okay.
It's about 300 kilowatt hours per capita, which is the equivalent of electricity for one TV and about 4 light bulbs.
Okay.
For every single man, woman, and child, including the babies, who shouldn't be watching TV, but 300 kilowatt hours on average, and then under 3 kids.
Mm.
And when you get all of those 3, then you're called India or Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines. They're all growing 6-7% a year, every year for the last 10 years, and they're going to carry on doing it for the next 20.
Mm-hmm.
If you get the 100% literacy or the 80% literacy, but without the lower fertility rate, you probably haven't got the savings to give you enough electricity. Probably not. I mean, Cote d'Ivoire might be there actually, and Senegal might be there. So they might just be getting there anyway, which is related, I think, to their currency regime in part. It helps them a little bit, but they haven't got the literacy yet. Mm-hmm. If you get to 100% literacy without that falling in fertility, what's going to happen is you're going to see a lot more Nigerians emigrating. You'll see a lot more remittances coming back, and that can help. It does help over time. But you are setting yourself up for the decline in fertility that will follow. As you educate every girl, that fertility rate will fall and the savings will come, but it might be 20 years' time, not 5 to 10 years after you've hit the education target. So if I was governor of Sokoto, I'd be saying educating women is my priority. If I was governor of Lagos, I'd be saying electricity. Cheap, affordable, reliable electricity is my priority now. And that's what we're going to mobilize the state resources to ensure that every business can create jobs knowing that they can get electricity priced at 9-10 cents per kilowatt hour. That would be my target. So I'd have different targets depending on different states.
Okay. So my big question, my big final question is going to be, and not, so when I get to my final question, it's going to be, if you had 5 minutes with Tinubu, how are you going to lay out the argument for him, mindful of all the political challenges he has to deal with in, getting this thing done. But before we get to my final question, we've got a question here again from Chris Ogunkoya. And it is to realize the 20 years change in our demographics. Would you say that the education investment priority should go into early years education for children? or how do we sequence the investment in education, knowing where we are as a country?
Yeah. I don't think it's about the early years. I think if you're getting kids to go to school at the moment, just getting kids to go to school from 5 to 11, leaving school at 11 able to read and write, would be a huge improvement for tens of millions of people. So that need, then women, particularly in the north, who are having a lot of kids at the moment, have got more scope to do something else. They've got more scope to earn some money, potentially. They've got, it's not everything. You're not turning yourself into Japan or Germany, but it's just about, can you do that first lift out of poverty? So I don't think it's the early years.
But in the book, you said,
I mean, early years meaning 3 to 5. I don't think it's relevant. It's 5 to 11. That primary school stuff is essential.
Yeah.
Sorry. That's right.
No. I mean, it's, again, I'm just thinking, how do we navigate this thing, right? There's so many moving parts. There's so many things. There are questions here on, as we are looking to improve, and it came from Okiti, who's the CEO Business Day newspapers. And as we are looking to encourage savings from the population, what should we be saying to government in terms of managing the cost of governance, right? Again, I preface by saying I know you're an economist, not a political scientist, but we're interested in, if we were to look back in time, to Europe, to Latin America, to Asia, as they were doing all of this stuff, what was the government also doing in managing the cost of governance?
Well, we all dream of having somebody like Lee Kuan Yew come in, and he says, right, this is the plan. It's going to take 10, 20 years to make sure all Singaporeans are educated. And then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do that. And he just does it. And he's there for decades and decades. And Kagami's trying to do that in Rwanda. Most of us are not that lucky to get that sort of leader. We get the guys who do their best sometimes, maybe look after themselves quite a bit along the way. But what I'm getting at, I think, in the book is that if the fundamentals are coming good, that enough people are going to school, and parents in Nigeria, like anywhere else, do want their kids to be successful, perhaps to be more successful than they are, and to have an easier life. And so there is that, of course, that desire. And if that's happening at an education level, a fertility level, the government of the day is not the most. Yes, it helps if you get a really good leadership, but you don't need it. So for a long time, India's been growing quite well actually since the 1990s. It's really taken off from the last 10. But this wasn't, because this is pre-Modi. India was picking up already, and people saying it grows at night. It doesn't grow in daytime when the government's doing anything, because they're useless. It grows at night, and now it's growing night and day, and it's a 24-hour engine, and that is where we will get to. Right? I guess part of the reason I wrote the book, though, is because if you look at the UN forecast for Nigeria, they say the fertility rate's not dropping below 3 before about 2060. So in 40 years' time, I could still be at conferences, just an extraordinarily old man, still hearing about the lack of savings, lack of finance, how can we get more money into the economy, unless something's done on this issue. And that's what distresses me. It's not just a Nigeria story. It's a Congo, Angola. There's a whole host of countries facing the same sort of issues. So the reason I'm writing it is because it's not too late to change where the kids' experience will be.
Yeah. So here's a challenge I have sometimes with reading a lot of these books, economics books on ideas on how to move forward, etc. There's a lot of argument, and your arguments resonate with me, but there are arguments for, say, and this is a question coming from Yemisi Akindele from Lagos. It would be nice to hear know what Mr. Robertson's perspective is on impact of access to finance for low-income citizens as a way of escaping poverty. So if I had like, anyone from Jeff Sachs, to Banerjee, they would focus more on how do we get cash to low-income people, right? How does that fit with your own theory?
It's not my area of expertise, but from what I've read, that the World Bank and a lot of the research is increasingly turning to the best thing you can do for a low-income family is just give them cash. Because in the main, people use it responsibly. Parents use it to send their kids to school. They use it to buy food and put it on the table. They're actually just direct cash grants are quite an effective way, one of the most effective ways, apparently, of alleviating poverty. Where I think it becomes a bit more, where I again a little controversial, is when I was thinking about microcredit, and I looked at where microcredit kind of was working, and it started off in Bangladesh 30, 40 years back, and they were giving little bits of money to women, and they were going out and forming businesses and being successful. Most of the microcredit globally is happening in South Asia. It's not happening in Africa. I think it was 94% in South Asia, 6% in Africa. And the question was why? And I think it's related to the fact that in Bangladesh and India, two things have happened. Firstly, we've got 70, 80% adult literacy. So women are educated enough to be able to do value-added money-earning work. Secondly, they've only got 2 kids. So actually, they have time to do this. And thirdly, because they've got 2 kids, they've already probably some savings in the village or in the family that they can tap if they run into trouble, which means they become very good credits. If you lend them a bit of money, actually, there is some cash there. Now, you take a village in, let's say, Niger, the highest fertility rate in the world. In Niger, the woman's got 7 kids. God knows how she's got the time to actually do any work that earns money on top of that. She's already got a full-time and a half job. There's no savings in the community, much less likely to be able to make a profit because everyone's going to be poor. And secondly, to be able to repay the loan if there's any kind of problems. And I think this is why microfinance works when you've already got some of the conditions that are looking good. It's that thing of banks are always available to lend you money when times are good. But when times are tough is when they take back the loans. That I think happens at a kind of a national and global level as well, unfortunately.
So a question on private sector, right? So have you seen any cases where the private sector played any kind of leading role in helping incentivize families to reduce a number of children, or is it all stuck in the hands of government?
I'm sure the people who make contraceptives might, but no, I think I have not seen that. Okay. I mean, even on the issue of education, we have not really seen kind of big companies get involved. I mean, I think what's fascinating to me is, I could chat to a taxi driver in Abuja, and he's sending 3 of his kids to school privately because he doesn't trust the government school. It's costing him a fortune. He doesn't earn that much as a taxi driver. But so that the private sector in that regard is playing an important role in trying to help parents get their kids educated. But I don't know if it's seen much more. Even on electricity, the private sector is maybe getting there. Solar power could be one of these areas that reduce the private sector, perhaps at least at household level, can be part of the answer. We'll see.
So another question from Tony Mamo. Can you suggest an incentive for folks to reduce their number of children, and conversely, some punishment to discourage folks from having excess children? But how would our tradition, religious beliefs be subservient to such sticks and carrots? Most folks feel God will provide their needs, and it's God's will that they procreate. So again, look, I'm sure some of the nations have seen this. Yeah.
No, I've been having this conversation in loads of places. And in Uganda, what was really interesting to me, because I think Uganda's about 20 years behind Kenya on a lot of these issues. But in Kampala, the middle class are having 2 to 3 kids. In Nairobi, it's definitely 2 to 3 kids and no more on average, except for Stanley, my friend, who's got at least 5. But you know, that thing, the middle class is already doing this. So this idea that there was this is our tradition. I come back to the point, it was our tradition. I come from Scotland. Oh, no, I don't. A little bit of me does. Up my paternal line. I was in Glasgow last Friday. I'd never been before. My great-great-great-great-grandfather moved there in the 1840s. I discovered that city, Glasgow, like Lagos today, was just booming in population terms. It rose 10 times the population in 100 years. And I think Lagos is doing similar.
Yeah.
Probably even faster, actually. So people like my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather were moving from the Highlands of Scotland, where they were illiterate and poor and living on a farm and making no money at all, moved to the city, got educated, and things started to come good. And they stopped having 7 kids. And they started to have 2. And it takes at least 2 generations from that, 7 kids or so, down to the 3 or 4 or 5. And then the next generation, it comes in at about 2 to 3. So it's usually a 2-generation process. And I don't think people have been focusing on it. I don't think there's ever been a private sector economist looking at the markets in the way that I do, who's looked at demographics and brought this stuff together. Because most people in my job just sit there going, what's the interest rate going to be next month? What's the inflation rate next month? And most development economists don't think about interest rates and the cost of capital, because most development economists are giving people's money away. They're giving taxpayers money to other countries. It's not about how do I make a profit here. It's how can I best allocate UK government resources to this country. I think differently, because I'm thinking, how do my investors make money when they invest somewhere? Are they going to make money? Are they going to lose it all in a currency devaluation? Why? Those are the sort of questions that, to me, it's much more about this issue of money, businesses, and getting access to finance. To me, is what I've been coming across every day for 25 years. How do I make money? How do I grow my business? How do I invest well? And I think that's where I'm bringing this stuff together, and hopefully it can make a difference.
And bringing it together to that, my big question of, you're now in this vehicle, traveling with Bola Tinubu, and you've got like 5 minutes or thereabout to make a big case for how he can navigate Nigeria out of poverty, right? Mindful of all the political challenges that many of the solutions may demand, what do you say to him?
I think the first thing I'd say to him is, do you want to be dependent on foreign capital? Do you want to be saying, please, China, lend us some money, please, America, give us some cash, or the World Bank, give us a loan? Or do you want your country to be self-sufficient, able to be self-sufficient? I don't mean closed off to the world, but able to stand tall, fund everything it needs, because that funding can only come from Nigerians. And those Nigerians are not going to have those savings when they're trying to feed 5.3 kids on average per woman. There just won't be savings in the country. And so the challenges that you're trying to address will never get addressed by in the next 10, 20 years, unless a start is made about getting fertility rates down. And how do you do that? You're only going to do that if you're educating girls. This should be a universal opportunity for every Nigerian, not just the blokes. It should be an opportunity, education should be an opportunity for everyone. And if you do that, if you get the fertility rates down, if you get everybody in education, you will have the savings to build the electricity you want, to build the roads, to build the ports, to industrialize and to take off, and for Nigeria to take its rightful place in the world economy.
So here's a practical problem with the proposition. So a few months, maybe last year sometime, I had an opportunity I had a conversation with Emir Sanusi, Emir of Kano, and the issue of girl education came up. And he said he understands that girls need to go to school. He understands that that's the way. But the practical problem, the practical challenge is with the religion. You need female teachers to teach the girl child. So it becomes a chicken and egg thing. You don't have the female teacher, so you don't get to teach the girl child. How do you break that issue? And I think there's a unique opportunity here for Muslim president and Muslim vice president to be able to drive a lot of reforms in the North that a Christian president probably would find more difficult. So there are very cultural, religious, roadblocks that we need to unblock. And if there is an advantage of this Muslim ticket, it could be that those difficult conversations, we can now put them on the front burner and find some solutions to them. One
of the books I was reading while writing this was about the brigadistas or something, something to do with Cuba. It's a book for teenagers, but I was reading it anyway. And Castro sent out students, 11 to 18-year-olds or 11 to 21-year-olds, to go and live with a family for a year, to teach the mums and the dads and everyone how to read and write. And I wondered, because in Nigeria, you've got that 1 year of university. After university, you get that 1 year of national service. I just wondered whether, does that provide, is that the sort of national service that could be done? There could be, people could be asked to go out and teach not just to the kids in the schools, but actually the mums as well. Get them to read and write so they can start to read what's on their mobile phone.
So that could be an approach to solving adult literacy challenges that we have in the country. How it addresses, because my focus is, if you look at the challenge, there are two sides of the challenge in Nigeria. There's the fertility rate question in southern Nigeria is not that much of a problem as it is in northern Nigeria, right? The girl education issue is not a big issue in southern Nigeria as it is in northern Nigeria. So as we think about how to escape poverty, one must also think about this bit of a dichotomy between the regions. And as I think about girl education in the north, the question is, where do we find the females who will teach the girls in the north? And I think it may have to be that some Muslim clerics and so on may need to reinterpret the Quran to then open up that space, for male teachers to step in and be able to teach, maybe under some form of being chaperoned or something. I don't know the answer to that, but we need some practical answers to these questions.
And it was done in Bangladesh, and I don't know how. So that issue of, and that's still a fairly conservative country, Muslim country, and they succeeded in doing it. And they started off the same issue, but very low adult literacy at independence. No thanks to the UK, and they've had to build, and it's taken them decades, because you educate a few girls at a high enough level, and then they can teach the next generation. But it takes some decades before you start to get enough teachers. Exactly is the point you're making. That's it's an interesting idea.
Excellent. Any new projects you're working on now? Any new books?
I am not settled talking about this one yet. I have not felt that it's when I'm bored of talking about it, when it's mainstream, when I'm hearing it back from politicians telling me this is what we need to do, it's like, okay, I'll stop talking about this. But no, not right now.
Charlie, thank you so much for making time to be with us, and I really appreciate this conversation.
It's been a great talk, Patrick. Really, really enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Thank you.